Welcome to Human Monsters. Before I begin, I want to send some extra love to my listeners in the United Kingdom. My reason for this is that there are a few jokes in this episode about your drinking habits, which differ from ours here in Canada and the United States. I just want you to know that there is no personal animus behind it. It is purely a good-natured ribbing. I have lots of love for the UK. According to Ancestry.com, about 94% of my lineage is traceable to England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. When the British Empire went around the world setting up franchises, Canada became part of the Commonwealth family and remains loyal as such to this day. We spell the word centre with an R-E, and we use the metric system. Queen Victoria's birthday is a holiday here, though most of us know very little about her. We mostly just see this so-called May 2-4 weekend as a chance to party. I also love bland food, and I struggle to express any other emotion besides anger. I wouldn't poke fun at my American listeners in this way, not just because most of my listeners are American, but because, well, they've got guns. Just kidding, Americans. I love you all. Now, on with the show. Ian Duncan Stewart was born on January 2nd, 1938, in Glasgow, Scotland. He was born out of wedlock, and his mother was unable to bear the financial strain of being a single mother on a waitress's income, so she gave him up when he was 2 months old. He was raised by her neighbors, the Sloan family. The Sloans were a middle-class family and lived so close to Ian's mother, Maggie, that she could visit regularly. Ian had a dark side, even as a small child. Like many serial killers, his sadistic tendencies were expressed through his treatment of animals. He broke a dog's leg and set another hapless canine on fire. He once decapitated a cat. When Ian was 9 years old, the Sloans moved to a suburb of Glasgow, and his visitations with his mother were stretched further apart by time and distance. He was enrolled in the Shadowlands Academy for Gifted Children. Circumstances appeared to be auspicious for the young boy. Life was his to ruin. Ian's violent tendencies survived the onset of late childhood. He graduated from torturing animals and now visited harm upon younger children who lived in his new neighborhood. He also committed property crimes like burglary and theft. His luck ran out when he was 15 years old. He was caught and tried in juvenile court. After he was shuffled through the judicial system, he was unwilling to suffer through the boredom of school any longer, so he dropped out and accepted any job that was available. He worked as a tea boy at a shipyard and later as a messenger for a butcher. His progress as a young adult screeched to a halt when his violent behavior manifested in all new extremes. When he found out his girlfriend went to a dance with another boy, he cut her with a switchblade. She reported the incident to the police. He was put on probation and was ordered to live at his mother's house. She was by then living in Manchester. She was married to an Irish man named Patrick Brady. Patrick was a fruit monger at the Smithfield Market. He hired Ian to work as a fruit porter. A few months later, Ian was caught stealing a bag of lead seals from Patrick's store, and he was not only fired, but arrested. Because Ian was still a minor at 17 years old, he served his 2-year sentence at a British prison for juveniles. The institution emphasized rehabilitation over a purely punitive approach to criminal reform, but their methods made no lasting impact on Ian Stewart. He got into trouble for brewing hooch alcohol. For this offense, he was transferred to a prison whose methods for reforming young criminals was comparably more severe and unforgiving. November 14th, 1957. Ian was released from prison into the custody of his mother. He was hired to work as an accountant and underwent training for the field. He eventually got hired to work as a clerk at Millward's Merchandising, which was a wholesale chemical plant in the town of Gorton. Ian began to develop himself intellectually at this time, though his reading material would not have exactly ingratiated him to society at large, especially considering how Britain was decimated during World War II. He read about the Nazis, though he was immune to the outrage with which most readers would have reacted. He taught himself German so he could read Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf in Der Führer's native tongue. He was also very taken with the writings of the Marquis de Sade, with a keen focus on the graphic descriptions of sexual violence in the 120 Days of Sodom. Some quotes from the latter. Nothing quite encourages as does one's first unpunished crime. I would, thank God, watch the universe perish without shedding a tear. Nothing that makes one hard is wicked, and the only crime in the world is to refuse oneself that pleasure. To combine incest, adultery, sodomy, and sacrilege, he buggers his married daughter with a host. He cuts off a young boy's 4 limbs, buggers the torso, feeds him well, and so keeps him alive. As the limbs were not cut off too close to the torso, he lives for a long time. He buggers him thus for more than a year. Marquis de Sade died in 1814, but he remains a phantom mentor, and his protégés continue to crop up throughout subsequent generations, with Ian Stewart among them. January 1961. A new typist was hired by Millward's Merchandising, 20-year-old Myra Hindley. Ian, having by then adopted the surname Brady, didn't give Hindley so much as a second look at first. He was put off by shortcomings noted in her appearance, like her peroxide blonde hair and heat marks on her legs from sitting too close to the fireplace at home. The two would interact at work nonetheless. Their offices were situated side by side. Hindley took his dictation and typed his letters. Myra gave Ian more than a passing glance. In fact, his name was appearing more and more often in her diary. She would write things such as, "Ian looked at me today," and "I wonder if Ian is courting, still feel the same," or "I love Ian all over again. He has a cold, and I would love to mother him." December 23rd. The company held their annual Christmas party. The staff would do their pre-drinking at a pub and then return to the work site for the real drinking. People who live in the UK drink in stages and levels, so this is normal for them. The typists were dancing and drinking. Ian Brady came into the room and gave them Christmas kisses. Among them were Myra Hindley, and unbeknownst to Ian, his kiss to her was at the top of her Christmas wish list. They hadn't reached the final stages or levels of their drinking, so Myra and Ian agreed to meet at a pub later that evening. He took her there and then to a movie. For the next several weeks, they would get together to see movies and stay up all night, discussing such things as religion and the Nazis. That, and they went to pubs to drink piss-warm British beer. It's yellow, it's foamy, and it's lukewarm. They even refer to getting drunk as getting pissed or being pissed. Their bodies barely have to process it. It goes in as piss and emerges with the same properties. The only difference between the input and the output is the flavor. After shitting Nazi propaganda into each other's brains and getting pissed on piss, the two got to know each other very well, and some commonalities began to emerge. Myra also came from a broken family. Her father was an alcoholic, but that hardly made him a standout. Chronic drinkers are as endemic to that part of the world as rapists are to the Congo. Like many alcoholics, he beat the shit out of his kids, which made him even more insufferable. Despite this, he encouraged her to be strong and fight the bullies of the world. Once, when a boy pushed her to the ground and scratched her, her father ordered her to track him down and punch him out. He told her that if she didn't, he would beat her until he knocked her out. Maybe she wouldn't have been so reluctant if he had given her a few drinks first. It always worked for him. Nevertheless, she did as she was told, and though she didn't knock the offending young lad unconscious, it was clear she had won the battle and the war. She made her pissed and child-abusing father proud. He probably raised another glass of piss, this time in her honor. Ian and Myra had a deep connection, in some regards like that of twins. While some couples might develop a secret code language based on inside jokes, obscure references, and pet names, Ian and Myra became fluent in German, and it enabled them to discuss anything they wanted in the company of others without them knowing. Their fascination with German culture didn't end with the language. After going to screenings of porn films, they would go back to Ian's place for Nazi cosplay. They would read aloud to each other in German and drink German brands of wine. By this time, they were so fixated on all things German that it was reflected in Myra's fashion choices. She dyed her hair blonde to look more Aryan. She wore red lipstick, high boots, short skirts, and leather jackets. They also created code words and gestures signifying body movements. One example was Groucho, and raising one's eyebrows twice meant to follow the direction of their eyes. Whenever they saw someone they deemed attractive, they used the term DC, which stood for delicious creature. At work, they were careful to minimize their interactions because they didn't want their colleagues to know they were dating. In 1962, Ian and Myra discovered Saddleworth Moor, a property that covered 400 square miles of land between Manchester and Huddersfield. It would play an important role in their lives in the years to come. Myra described the power Ian had over her by the time he discovered Saddleworth Moor. Within months, he had convinced me that there was no God at all. He could have told me that the earth was flat, the moon was made of green cheese, and the sun rose in the west. I would have believed him. Such was his power of persuasion. Though it always seems that similarities in personality, interests, and lifestyle are necessary for the formation of a healthy relationship, it is possible for two people to have the wrong things in common. Though Ian Brady and Myra Hindley loved each other very much and connected with each other as they would not have with anybody else, they nevertheless brought out the worst in each other. Case in point, in 1963, Ian and Myra declared to each other their intention to rob banks, and the plans were in motion. Myra joined a gun club. Ian couldn't join because of his criminal record. Myra rented a van, and they would drive through the streets in search of banks that lent themselves to the kind of heists they were planning. There was enough storage space in the van for the guns and bags of cash. About that time, Brady became passionate about photography. He went as far as to create his own darkroom. It made sense. He wanted to take nude photos of Myra, and most developers in town would likely have objected to processing the photos on moral grounds. Myra's younger sister, Maureen, had a boyfriend named David Smith. Maureen knew about Ian's photography setup, and she asked Ian to take some photographs of her that she could give to David. While Ian took the photos, he asked her several questions about David. He wanted to know if David would be interested in making some money. At some point, Maureen told Ian that David was seen with her neighbor, Pauline Reed. He was a boyfriend in title only. He was otherwise a free agent. David's prospects weren't exactly bolstered by his prickly relations with the Hindley family. Her mother would send him away saying, "I can't stand the thought of Mo having anything to do with that dirty bugger." Ian and Myra gathered all available intelligence on David Smith and went searching for him. The first time they tracked him down, he was standing in an alley. They weren't much impressed by him at first sight. Ian told Myra that a biological relative would make an ideal accomplice, since they would be less likely to turn them into police. Myra didn't want Maureen to be directly involved in any criminal activity. Ian said that if they didn't employ David Smith and he didn't marry Maureen, they could take care of him. Myra was so pleased by this idea, she smiled. David Smith did marry Maureen when he found out she was pregnant with his child. Maureen's family still did not accept him. He wasn't gainfully employed, and he had an extensive criminal record, which included several acts of violence. Like Ian Brady, David Smith was abandoned by his mother at an early age. His adoptive parents could not manage his recalcitrant behavior, and he became a juvenile delinquent. He chafed against authority, on some occasions retaliating against adults with violence. His criminality reached its apex when he broke into a home at the age of 15. In October of 1963, David Smith met Ian Brady outside of Millwards as David was waiting for Maureen's shift to end. Ian offered David a ride home. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were getting serious about their criminal plans. They sat on their living room floor and concocted those plans on paper, outlining every step they would take. As they drank red German wine, the temperature of pre-bled blood, they wrote a following list of preparations and precautions. Eventually, they would ditch the plans in favor of other, more violent offenses. July 12, 1963. The Reed family lived next door to Ian and Myra. Their eldest daughter, Pauline, attended the same school as Maureen Hindley and David Smith. On this day, she was en route to a dance at the Railway Workers' Social Club. It was a 10-minute walk from her house. She tried to interest two friends into going, but their mothers wouldn't let them because alcohol was to be served, thereby delaying their excessive alcohol intake by a maximum of 2 years. Pauline left her house at 7:45 p.m. As she passed a black van that was parked, she heard the driver's side window squeak. Myra bellowed out at Pauline, asking her where she was headed. Pauline stopped and told her she was going to the dance. She recognized Myra, and they talked for a few minutes. At one point, Myra pointed at some vinyl records that were sitting on the passenger seat. She told Pauline she would give them to her if she went with her to Saddleworth Moor to help her find an expensive glove she lost there that morning. Pauline was still early for the dance, so she decided to kill time by accompanying Myra to Saddleworth Moor. After Ian spent some time with his parents, establishing the verbal record of his comings and goings so that he could create a solid alibi, he went to the spot where the van was parked. When he saw that Myra had departed, he headed to Saddleworth Moor. When Ian arrived at the moor, he saw that Myra was sitting in the van with a teenaged girl. Myra introduced him to Pauline. Myra said they better get started on looking for the glove before it got too dark. They walked toward the house. Ian walked 15 feet ahead of the girls. After they walked over a small hill and were out of sight of the road, Myra said to Brady, "Groucho." On that cue, Ian walked up to Pauline, grabbed her head, and put her in a stranglehold. Pauline fell to the ground. She looked back at Ian's eyes. If he had been an empath, he would have been shaken by the look of shock and horror in her eyes. But he wasn't. He told her to be quiet, and she would be all right. Pauline looked to Myra for answers and mercy. but Myra just smiled and told Pauline to keep quiet. Pauline shouted a declaration that she was not well, implying that she was experiencing complications due to menstruation. Myra dropped to her knees at Pauline's side and unbuttoned her coat. Ian remained standing as he kept watch over the property as Myra undressed Pauline. Myra began to fondle Pauline's breasts. Exchanging cooperation in hopes of being rewarded with mercy, Pauline lay down on the ground. She let Myra do what she wanted with her body. Myra kissed her breasts. After having removed the last of Pauline's clothing, Ian took off his clothes, and they had a threesome. At nightfall, Ian stood and told Pauline to put her clothes back on. When she reached for her necklace, Myra snatched it from her and said, "You won't need this where you're going." Strangely, this made Ian angry. He slapped Myra across the face. Myra went silent for the time being. He went to the van to retrieve the materials he would need to complete his mission for the night. In the meantime, Myra picked up a knife she brought with her and tried to stab Pauline in the chest. The blade was bent, so it didn't break any skin. She ditched the knife and punched Pauline in the face a few times until her nose began to bleed. When Brady returned, he was frustrated that Myra had not killed Pauline. He pulled out his knife and slashed her throat. Blood blasted out of the wound, but she was still standing. Ian slit her neck again. This time he punctured the carotid artery, and within seconds she was dead. Myra told Ian that her name was Pauline Reed. He didn't remember her, but then he recalled that he had a conversation with Maureen and realized he killed her competition for David Smith. They would have liked to take pictures of Pauline's corpse, but it was too dark to do so, with Brady always being reliant on natural light. Ian told Myra to return the knife and camera to the van and bring back the spade. After Ian dug a 5-foot hole with the spade, he and Myra buried Pauline. They changed out of the clothes they were wearing, and Ian buried the spade. They took note of the exact location of the grave, should they have had to return to it in the future. When Myra pulled up to her family's neighborhood with the van, Pauline's mother was looking for Pauline in the street. At 2:30 a.m., Ian and Myra were cutting up and burning the clothes they wore when they raped and killed Pauline. Pauline's father got out of bed and went to the social club to look for his daughter. Myra would give a very different account of how the rape and murder took place years later. She would claim that Ian carried out both crimes while she was in the house looking for the glove. Several weeks later, the police hadn't narrowed in on a suspect, and the case went cold. Having recovered from the excitement and panic of committing the crime, Ian and Myra would search for a new victim. A couple of months later, Ian and Myra went to Saddleworth Moor for the day and were shocked to see that North Sea Gas were digging a trench for a new pipeline. They narrowly avoided unearthing the spade and Pauline Reed's body. Ian and Myra decided on a town called Ashton-under-Lyne as the location where they would hunt for a new victim. They settled on a date, November 23rd. They rented a car to further decrease their recognizability. John Kilbride went to the movies with a friend. After seeing the film, they went to Ashton Market to earn some pocket money, providing assistance to the vendors. At 6 p.m., John's friend went home, but John decided to stay. As he stood near a large garbage bin, humanoid garbage specimen Myra Hindley approached him and told him she lost her glove. That fucking bitch whore cunt would never have been designated Isotoner's Employee of the Month. Ian watched the crowd to ensure there wouldn't be witnesses who could recall the exchange. Eventually, Myra was persuasive enough that she led John to her car, and they got in. Myra soon picked up Ian and they drove to the moor. John became uneasy after they arrived. He wanted to know what they were doing there because their occupation at the property was basically a squatter's situation, and it was too dark by then to find an errant glove. Brady looked over at Myra and said, "Groucho!" Myra grabbed John. He began to struggle and kick at her, but mostly in vain, since he was only 12 years old. Ian got involved with the struggle and helped bring John down to the ground. Ian pulled down John's pants and underwear. Myra held on to John's legs. Ian raped John. Once Ian climaxed, he strangled John unto his death with his bare hands. Ian dug up the spade and then dug John's grave. They dropped his corpse face down. Before covering him in soil, Ian slapped John's buttocks and said, "Take that, you bastard." Myra's version of the events, of course, placed most of the blame on Ian. When they got home, they observed their usual post-kill regimen, like cutting up and burning the clothes they wore. Meanwhile, John Kilbride's parents were frantically searching for him with the assistance of 100 volunteers. The police even consulted a psychic who envisioned with uncanny accuracy the topography of the place where John was buried. June 16, 1964, the day that Keith Bennett vanished. He lived in the township of Longsight with his mother Winnie and his stepfather Jimmy Johnson. Winnie planned to play bingo that night. She left the house at 7:45 p.m. with Keith in tow. He was to spend the night at his grandmother's home. He and Winnie parted ways at a crossroads. A woman saw him walking alone, and she beckoned to him with a job offer. If he helped her lift some boxes, she would compensate him monetarily. He was always eager to make some extra pocket money, so he got in her car without delay. According to Myra's account, Ian was sitting in the back seat when Keith got into the car. It was Ian who decided on Keith. Myra drove them to Saddleworth Moor. As Myra told it, Ian and Keith walked ahead of her into the property. She stayed back to keep an eye out for interlopers. Ian signaled to her that he wanted her to stop following them and remain where she was. Myra waited around until Ian returned a half hour later. Keith wasn't with him, but Ian was carrying the spade. Myra asked him if he raped Keith. He stonewalled her. She said she never saw Keith's body after he was killed. Ian developed the photos that were taken of Keith. Myra claimed Keith was bathed in blood. Ian was disappointed by how blurry the pictures were, so he discarded them. Ian's version. As all three of them walked further onto the moor, Keith said he was expected at his grandmother's house and was due to arrive there within the hour. Myra promised him that they would return him in time. After they walked for 3 miles, Ian stopped walking and began to whistle a song. This was Myra's cue to grab hold of Keith and restrain him. Keith panicked and began to scream. Ian grabbed him by the throat from behind. Keith fell to the ground. He began to kick and scream whilst down there. Myra wrestled with him to get him under control. Ian jumped on his back and put his hands around his neck again. Myra pulled Keith's pants down and held onto his legs. Ian sodomized Keith, keeping his hands wrapped around his neck all the while. Once Ian ejaculated, he choked Keith unto his death. Ian got up and put his clothes back on. Myra rotated Keith's body so that he was lying face up. Ian snapped a few photos of Keith's corpse, careful to keep the lens in focus this time. They buried Keith as they had the others, except they marked his grave with a stone. Ian and Myra went home, destroyed the clothes they wore during the murder, and called it a night. Keith's mother and grandmother frantically searched the streets for him after he failed to turn up at his grandmother's house. His stepfather was the prime suspect in his disappearance, creating considerable stress for the family. December 26, 1964. A Christmas fair was to take place on Boxing Day, and there were to be several attractions that appealed to children. Hearing that an event would be well attended by children, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady decided it was high time to plan another murder. 2 p.m. Myra took her grandmother to her son's house across town. Myra and Ian were living in her grandmother's house, and they needed to clear it out to facilitate their latest bloodbath. She was to pick up her grandmother at 9:30 p.m. Leslie Ann Downey was 10 years old. She lived with her mother, Ann, her brother Tommy, and her stepfather Alan West. Leslie Ann, Tommy, and a few other kids went to the fair, as they had for many years. Leslie Ann had 6 pennies for pocket money. Once the kids spent themselves penniless, all of them except Leslie Ann went home. A show was staged for the attendees, and she wanted to watch it. She told the other kids she would catch up with them. Myra's version. Myra said Ian discovered Leslie Ann and approached her first. He dropped some boxes close by and asked her if she would help him pick them up for some financial compensation. After placing the boxes in the car, all 3 of them drove off. When they arrived at their house, Ian brought Leslie Ann upstairs to a bedroom. Myra remained downstairs alone. As she told it, she kept watching over the front door so that if anybody popped by, she would turn them away. Ian told Myra to fill the bathtub with warm water. Ian was alone with Leslie Ann in the bedroom for so long the water went cold twice and had to be refilled. When Myra went into the bedroom, she saw that Leslie Ann was lying on the bed face down. She assumed she was dead. Myra noticed streaks of blood running down Leslie Ann's legs. After a thorough investigation, it was proven that Myra was more involved with Leslie Ann's rape and murder than she was willing to admit. Ian's version. Ian said Myra picked up Leslie Ann at the fair by herself and picked up Brady at another location a few blocks away. An audio recording was made while they tortured Leslie Ann, and all 3 voices were heard. The following was transcribed verbatim from that recording. Ian, get out of the fucking road. Get in the fucking basket. A door was heard banging. Footsteps advancing across the floor. Somebody blew into the microphone. More footsteps. A woman speaks, but she is whispering, and her words are not clearly recorded. Some light footsteps across the room. More whispered conversation beyond the microphone's ability to retain the content of the dialogue. Leslie Ann, don't! Mom, ah! Leslie Ann screams. Ian, shut up! Leslie Ann, oh please, oh help! Myra, shh, shh, shut up! Leslie Ann screamed loudly again. Myra, shut up, shut up! A gurgling sound is heard. Leslie Ann begins to cry. Heavy footsteps are heard approaching from a staircase. They enter the room. Leslie Ann is still crying. Ian, here. Myra, hush, hush, go on. Leslie Ann continues to cry, though at a decrease of volume, leading to a moaning sound. Myra, you are all right. Hush, hush. Put it in your mouth. Hush, and shift that hand. Leslie Ann was still crying. Myra, put it in your mouth and keep it in, and you'll be all right. Put it in. Stop it. If you don't, shh. Leslie Ann's cries were more muffled now. Ian, put it in. Put it in. Put it in. Keep it in. Stop it now. Stop it now. Myra, I'm only doing this, and you'll be all right. Put it in your mouth. Put it in. In. Ian and Myra engaged in a whispered conversation that was inaudible to the microphone. Myra, will you stop it? Stop it. Shut. Ian, quick, put it in now. Leslie Ann whimpered. Her gag reflex was triggered, and she made a retching sound and was on the verge of vomiting. Leslie Ann, what's this in for? Ian, put it in. Leslie Ann, can I just tell you something? I must tell you something. Please take your hands off me a minute. Please. Please, Mummy, please. I can't tell you. Leslie Ann let out a loud grunting noise. Leslie Ann, I can't tell you. I can't breathe. I can't. Dad, will you take your hands off me? Ian, no. Tell me. Leslie Ann, please, God. Ian, tell me. Leslie Ann, I can't while you got your hands on me. Ian, why don't you keep it in? Leslie Ann, why? What are you going to do with me? Ian, I want some photographs, that's all. Put it in. Leslie Ann, don't undress me, will you? Myra, that's right, don't. Leslie Ann, it hurts me. I want to see Mummy, honest to God. Ian, put it in. Leslie Ann, I swear on the Bible. Ian, put it in and hurry up now. The quicker you do this, the quicker you'll get home. Leslie Ann, I've got to go because I'm going out with my mama. Leave me, please. Help me, will you? Ian, put it in your mouth and you'll be all right. Leslie Ann, will you let me go when this is out? Ian, yes. The longer it takes you to do this, the longer it takes you to get home. Leslie Ann, what are you going to do with me first? Ian, I'm going to take some photographs. Put it in your mouth. Leslie Ann, what for? Ian, put it in your mouth. Right in. Right in. Leslie Ann, I'm not going to do it. Ian, put it in. If you don't get that hand down, I'll slit your neck. Leslie Ann, won't you let me go, please? Ian, no. Put it in. Stop talking. What's your name? Leslie Ann. Leslie. Ian. Leslie what? Leslie Ann. Ann. Ian. What's your second name? Leslie Ann. Westford. Westford. Ian. Westford? Leslie Ann. I have to get home before 8 o'clock. I've got to get, or I'll get killed if I don't. Honest to God. Ian. Yes. Myra left the room and disappeared down the stairs. After some clicking sounds, Myra came back up and re-entered the room. Ian, what is it? Myra, I've left the light on. Ian, you have? Myra, so that... Myra trailed off into indecipherable silence. Leslie Ann began to cry again. She said, it hurts my neck. Ian, hush, put it in your mouth and you'll be all right. Myra, now listen, stop crying. Leslie Ann, it hurts me. Myra, hush, shut up, now put it in. Pull that hand away and don't dally, and just keep your mouth shut, please. Wait a bit, I'll put this on again, do you get me? Leslie Ann, no, Myra, shh, hush. Put that in your mouth, and again, packed more solid. Leslie Ann, I want to go home. Honest to God, Her speech is muffled. Before 8 o'clock. Myra, no, it's all right. Ian, eh? For a while, music and muffled voices were heard in the recording. The music decreased in volume after 3 precisely timed, loud cracking noises. Meanwhile, Leslie Ann's family searched their neighborhood. Her stepfather was brought in for questioning. Ian took photos of the abuse, and these were in focus. Leslie Ann was tied to the bed. She was wearing some kind of leather outfit, presumably some kind of BDSM getup. Leslie Ann was also pictured naked and contorted into different poses, including a praying stance, kneeling, and one with her arm aloft. Ian also pointed out that Myra was involved in the rape of Leslie Ann. She strangled her with a silken cord while Brady pinned Leslie Ann down. Leslie Ann was buried at Saddleworth Moor among the others. While Ian walked off to retrieve his spade, a police officer suddenly pulled up. Myra panicked because Leslie Ann's corpse was still in the trunk of their car. He asked her if everything was okay. She said she was just letting her spark plugs dry out. He believed her and drove away. Later that night, Myra fingered the cord of silk while drinking her pint of piss at the pub. Ian and Myra were spending more time with Maureen and David. Ian and David would often stay up drinking into the early morning hours. Ian would open up, revealing sides of him to David that he wouldn't dare disclose to just anybody. He gave David a copy of a book entitled The Life and Ideas of Marquis de Sade. He emphasized certain quotes like, "Should murder be punished by murder?" On October 2nd, Ian told David he had killed before and documented it photographically. He said he would kill again just to prove to David that he wasn't joking. On October 5th, David told Ian and Myra that he and Maureen received an eviction notice. They were in arrears to the tune of £14 and 8 shillings. Doesn't sound like much, but in the mid-1960s, £14 could buy you a lot of piss-warm beer in Great Britain. With that 8 shillings, you could buy a few packets of crisps to go with it. Ian proposed they obtain the funds by what he referred to as, quote-unquote, rolling a queer. It would consist of finding a homosexual and offering him sex if he went home with them, whereupon they would extort his money. Ian's reasoning was that because homosexuality was still a crime in England at the time, the victim wouldn't report the incident to the police for fear that they would be charged with sodomy. I swear I didn't choose this case for Pride Month. October 6th, 1965. Edward Evans was 17 years old and lived in the Ardwick district of Manchester with his family. He was an apprentice engineer, and with no plans to marry a woman and have children, he was likely engorged with disposable income. Edward arranged to meet his friend Michael Mahone at a gay bar called Auntie's Bar. The owner of the bar, George Smith, recalled that Edward appeared around 7 p.m. Michael stood him up. They planned to attend a soccer game. Edward decided to go alone. At about 10:30 p.m., Ian and Myra went to a shop to buy some wine. Afterwards, they drove to the Manchester train station and parked. Ian went into the station while Myra remained in the car. A police officer told her to move the car because it was illegally parked or else she would get a ticket. Meanwhile, Ian went into the station and he saw a man he recognized. Ian saw him at a gay pub in Manchester a couple of times, though they never had occasion to meet. They spoke for a few minutes. According to Ian, he invited Edward to accompany him to his place for a drink. The implication was that it would lead to a sexual encounter. Edward was game, and they got in the car with Myra. Ian told Edward she was his sister to dispel any suspicions Edward could have considered. Skipping past Myra's account, which always seemed to cast her as a reluctant, put-upon accomplice, Ian said that after getting situated indoors, they had some wine and talked for a while. At one point, Myra went upstairs to change. This was Ian's cue. Ian and Edward began to get hot and heavy, leading to kissing and oral sex. Once the men finished with their sexual exchange, they put their clothes back on and had some more wine. Suddenly, they heard Myra and David Smith. They came through the front door. Ian jumped up and ran to them. Ian said to David, "Do you still want those miniatures? They are in the kitchen." Myra and David walked to the kitchen. Ian went back to the living room and walked in behind the sofa on which Edward was sitting. Ian retrieved an axe from underneath the sofa. He He swung it downward, and Edward turned around just in time to see the blade coming down like impending doom. It bounced off his head. Ian hoped to see blood spraying out of a gaping wound and maybe a few blobs of brain matter sliding down Edward's neck. More likely than not, he just gave him a headache when it bounced off his cranium. Nevertheless, it was sufficiently painful that Edward screamed. Ian kept swinging because this was one lumberjack who knew he would not get away with this crime until he knew the right moment to yell timber. Myra and David ran in from the kitchen to watch. For sickos like them, this was mutual masturbation material, but they just watched with their jaws agape. Dogs were on the premises and they were barking loudly in the kitchen. No doubt their sensitive noses detected the scent of fresh blood in the air, signifying there was meat so freshly slaughtered their owners needn't wait to fork it out of a can. Such a ruckus was created that Myra's grandmother shouted from upstairs because the commotion disrupted her sleep. Myra promised her that they would put a lid on the racket. After about a dozen chops to the head, Edward refused to die. Ian went to the kitchen and grabbed an electrical cord. He strangled Edward to death with it. Now that Edward was dead, Ian handed the axe to David. He said he did it to ensure David's prints were on the handle. They had quite a mess to clean. Blood was splattered all over the walls, floors, and carpets. Surveying the final vestiges of the carnage, Ian said, "This is the messiest murder I have committed." He removed Edward's wallet from his pants. He put the wallet, Edward's shoes, and the axe into a large travel bag. They placed his corpse upstairs in a spare bedroom. They wrapped it in a plastic sheet and a blanket. It took them 3 hours to clean all the blood from the living room. The following is an account of this incident from David Smith's perspective. It was transcribed verbatim. Brady opened the door and he said in a very loud voice, "Do you want those miniatures?" I nodded my head to say yes, and he led me into the kitchen and gave me 3 miniature bottles of spirits and said, "Do you want the rest?" When I first walked into the house, the door to the living room was closed. Ian went into the living room and I waited in the kitchen. I waited about a minute or two, then suddenly I heard a hell of a scream. It sounded like a woman, high-pitched. Then the screams carried on, one after another, loud. Then I heard Myra shout, "Dave, help him!" very loud. When I ran in, I just stood inside the living room, and I saw a young lad. He was lying with his head and shoulders on the couch, and his legs were on the floor. He was facing upwards. Ian was standing over him, facing him, with his legs on either side of the young lad's legs. The lad was still screaming. Ian had a hatchet in his hands. He was holding it above his head, and he hit the lad on the left side of his head with the hatchet. I heard the blow. It was a terribly hard blow. It sounded horrible. David said he was worried Ian would kill him that night, but once they were done with the cleaning and the corpse, Ian sent him on his way. David was so afraid of the prospect of Ian killing him at that point that as he walked home, he would jump at any sound he heard. Indeed, David Smith was not a murderer at heart like Ian Brady. He was so traumatized by the incident that as soon as he returned home, he ran to the bathroom to throw up. He began to moan as if he were on the verge of weeping. It woke Maureen, and when she went to the bathroom to see what the matter was, she was shocked when she saw that he was covered in blood. David confessed that Ian and Myra committed a murder. Maureen was thrown by this, but she decided they must go to the police. David agreed, but he decided they must wait until the morning, because if Ian saw them leaving so soon after the murder, he might figure out what they were about to do. Maureen agreed, and at 6 a.m. they left their house, whereupon they went to a phone booth. David took a kitchen knife with him. Maureen brought a screwdriver. David called the police and explained to them what he witnessed. A squad car picked them up and brought them to the station for questioning. After questioning, Superintendent Bob Talbot met with Sergeant Carr, and they paid a visit to Myra's grandmother's house. David informed the officers that Ian had at least 2 guns and usually departed for work at 8:30 a.m. Talbot made arrangements for 24 uniformed officers to be stationed at the scene during the search. 8:30 came and went, still no Ian Brady. When Talbot saw a delivery man dropping off loaves of bread down the street, he borrowed the man's work jacket and knocked on the door. Talbot went to the rear of the house and knocked on the back door. Myra answered. She was surprised to see a bread delivery man. From their dialogue, Talbot, is your husband in? Myra, I haven't got a husband. Talbot, I am a police superintendent, and I have reason to believe there is a man in the house. Myra, there's no man here. Talbot, I have received a report that an act of violence took place here last night, and we are investigating it. Myra, there's nothing wrong here. Talbot pushed past her. He removed the white coat. Myra now realized that he really was a detective. She said, He's in the other room. He's in the other room on the bed. When Talbot went in the living room, Ian Brady was sitting on his sofa. Brady was shocked to see him. Talbot searched the room while Sergeant took a look around the kitchen. Talbot informed Brady that they were there to investigate the report of a murder. Talbot wanted to search upstairs. When he went upstairs, he found that one of the bedrooms was locked. Myra told him that she kept the key at work. Talbot told her he wasn't going to leave until she gave him the key. He even offered to send an officer to Millward's to get the key for her. Myra responded with silence. Ian said to her, You better give him the key. A fight got out of hand last night. It's upstairs. This was Ian's hint to Myra to use a story to explain the presence of the corpse. Myra escorted Talbot upstairs and led him into the room. After surveying the overview of the room, Talbot noticed a bloody axe in a large travel bag. This was enough. He went back downstairs and told Ian to get dressed. Talbot told 2 officers to watch over Brady. Ian and Myra had once devised a plan to carry out in the event of being arrested. Basically, Ian would shoot Myra and then kill himself. The guns were left upstairs, so obviously this option was off the table. Ian was placed under arrest. Myra was not taken into custody. She insisted on going to the station anyway. She brought her dog, named Puppet, with her. She refused to make a statement except to insist that Edward Evans' death was accidental. She kept repeating to the detective that questioned her, I didn't do it. Ian didn't do it. I am saying nothing. Ask Ian. Whatever Ian has done, I have done. Myra submitted samples of her blood and saliva nevertheless. Meanwhile, the police searched Myra's grandmother's house thoroughly. Very little incriminating material could be gleaned from the search, though they did peruse a notebook that belonged to Ian Brady. The name John Kilbride was written within. October 11th, 1965. Myra was charged as an accessory to the murder of Edward Evans. Before she was arrested, she burned papers and envelopes that had belonged to Ian. Allegedly, they contained plans for bank robberies and murders. She called Millward's Merchandising to request that they terminate both hers and Ian's employment so they could receive unemployment benefits. They didn't give them any quid, whatever that is. As a lifelong resident of the North American continent, I haven't learned the quid math. At the station, Ian Brady confessed to murdering Edward Evans. He insisted that he and David Smith were responsible, and that Myra Hindley had no involvement whatsoever. This is the verbatim transcript of Brady's official statement. Last night I met Eddie in Manchester. We were drinking, and then we went home to Hattersley. We had an argument, and we came to blows. After the first few blows, the situation got out of control. When the argument started, Dave Smith was at the front door, and Myra called him in. Eddie kicked me at the beginning of the ankle. There was a hatchet on the floor, and I hit Eddie with it. After that, the only noise Eddie made was a gurgling. When Dave and I began cleaning up the floor, the gurgling stopped. Then we tied up the body, Dave and I. Nobody else helped. Dave and I carried it upstairs. Then we sat in the house until 3 or 4 in the morning. Then we decided to get rid of the body in the morning, early the next day or next night. October 7th, Ian Brady was formally charged with the murder of Edward Evans. October 11th, Myra was arrested and charged with the murder of Edward Evans. His blood was found on both Ian and Myra's clothing. There were also droplets of his blood on a pair of Myra's shoes. David Smith was questioned by police, and he told them the complete truth about the murder. He was granted immunity in exchange for his full cooperation. He also told them about a locker that was rented by Ian at Manchester Central Station. The police ran a search of the locker. They found 9 photographs of a naked girl who was tied up. An audio tape of her screaming and begging to be returned to her mother was also found. The girl was soon identified as 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. Also found were numerous photos of Saddleworth Moor and a notepad containing the name of John Kilbride. A neighbor of Ian Brady told police that Ian and Myra had taken him to the moor once. The police dispatched 150 officers to the moor to search the property for bodies. October 16th, Saddleworth Moor. One of the investigating officers, Robert Spears, was in the middle of searching the property when he went to an isolated area to relieve himself. At one point, he looked over at a spot where he noticed what appeared to be a bone protruding from the ground. He and Detective Talbot dug through the soil with their hands until they found what was unmistakably a human arm. It appeared as though it had been unearthed and stripped of its flesh by animals. Such were the remains of Leslie Ann Downey. Her mother, Anne, confirmed her identity the next day. She also listened to the torture tape. Her husband was not allowed to view the body since he was still a suspect. The police searched the grounds using photographs of Myra Hindley as a guide. She had posed at various spots. They would poke sticks into the soil until they detected the stench of putrefaction. The first to be found using this technique was John Kilbride. Ian Brady was charged for this murder with Myra as an accessory. Ian and Myra tried to marry, since married convicts are allowed to contact each other in Britain. Their application was rejected. They would send each other letters written in German. Ian asked Myra to send him some erotic prose, like the description of a scenario involving the torture of a child. April 19th, 1966. The criminal trial of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley began. Safety glass had to be installed to protect Brady and Hindley. They had received countless death threats from an outraged public. It was also set up to protect prosecutors and witnesses, as Brady would try to spit on them as they made their way to the stand. Both Brady and Hindley pleaded not guilty. Among the witnesses who testified was Maureen Hindley, who claimed that Myra changed after she met Ian, who corrupted her. Ian maintained during his testimony that Myra was not involved in the murders. Myra echoed this claim. May 6th. After seeing articles of evidence like the bloodied axe and hearing the recording of Leslie Ann Downey's pleas for clemency, the jury began deliberations at 2:40 p.m. At 5 p.m., they returned with their verdict. Ian Brady was found guilty of all 3 murders. Myra Hindley was found guilty of 2 of the killings, those being of Edward Evans and Leslie Ann Downey. The judge handed down their sentences with the following statement. Ian Brady, these were 3 calculated, cruel, cold-blooded murders. In your case, I pass the only sentence which law now allows, which is 3 concurrent sentences of life imprisonment. Put him down. In your case, Hindley, you have been found guilty of 2 equally horrible murders, and in the third as an accessory after the fact. On the 2 murders, the sentence is 2 concurrent sentences of life imprisonment, and on the charge of being an accessory after the fact to the death of Kilbride, a concurrent sentence of 7 years imprisonment. Put her down. 2 days after their sentencing, the judge sent a letter to the Home Secretary. Though I believe Brady is wicked beyond belief, without hope of redemption, I cannot feel that the same is necessarily true of Hindley once she is removed from his influence. At present, she is deeply corrupted as Brady, but is not so long ago that she was taking instruction in the Roman Catholic Church and was a communicant and a normal sort of girl. Myra was dispatched to Holloway Prison in London. Ian Brady was sent to Durham Prison. They never saw each other again. They did write letters to each other. Ian's first letter to Myra. Dear Myra, it's a beautiful morning. Clear blue sky, a sharp early tang in the air, and the sun's radiance hot on the skin. There's an old clock tower near here. The chimes ring out every quarter of an hour. That sound, combined with the warbling of the birds, helps to produce a pleasant backdrop and reduce the stark realities of the present, cheerful country sounds. I work in my cell during the day, sewing mail bags, which may not be an ideal mode of work, but it's surprising how quickly time goes while doing it. Well, Myra, I hope you've gotten over the initial shock of your sentence. I at least got what I expected, but you should never have been on any charge, except for harboring. Keep your chin up. The day you are released will be the happiest day of my life. I expect none happier. So clear your mind of well-justified hate and bitterness, and approach each day in hope and each person as an individual. Never express despair. You have a future, and I will see you begin life anew, and so I'll dwell once more in freedom as seen through your eyes. But for now, keep your eyes looking towards the sky. Ignore the grimy ground till you again tread grass underfoot. I'm counting on you by gaining your freedom to bring me back to life. So don't let me down, kiddo. Ich werde Sie nicht vergessen. That's German for I will not forget you. Myra's response. I don't for a minute think they'll grant my appeal, but I have nothing to lose by trying, and what's a year with sentences like ours? Anyway, I've been convicted and branded a murderess, so I'm not just sitting back and accepting it. We know each other, and one day, in the fullness of time, the truth will out. It must be so. I dreamed last night that Smith had died, or left Maureen, and she came forward and said that she lied about Ashton Market, etc. She had her baby last week, a boy. I think her conscience will start bothering her pretty soon. Here I am. Sunday, 7:30 p.m., there's a strong wind blowing, rattling the leaves on the many trees in the gardens outside my cell. It sounds just like home. There's a weeping willow in the center of the lane. I feel rather like one myself tonight. I feel desolate, not because I'm on my own, of course, but because you aren't here. I miss you all the time, but sometimes more than others. I hate Sundays anyway. You've read, of course, about all the publicity concerning the girl at school whose mother kept her off because she wasn't allowed to wipe her cutlery on a napkin. I read yesterday that the People had bought her story for £800, and the BBC have paid her £130. What a waste of money. I'll sign off again until tomorrow. I wear wax earplugs some nights. The girl in the next room sometimes spends her nights crying for her sister, so I put plugs in and cut that noise off. This cell is perfect for peace and quiet. I wish I could remain here indefinitely. However, if I move to the Star Wing, I hope to remain under Rule 43, isolation from fellow prisoners as they were both child sex offenders, and cherish any solitude. It suits me fine. Myra appealed her conviction in 1966, but it was rejected. She exchanged letters with Ian until March 1972, when Myra ended their relationship. She had become a born-again Christian, and she knew that, being an atheist, he would never approve. Myra requested to be placed within the general population of the prison without an escort to ensure her safety, and to her relief, she was not torn to shreds like a pack of hyenas stripping the carcass of a gazelle. She enrolled in a course offered by what was called the Open University. She took a humanities class, as if humanity was a characteristic with which she was familiar. In January 1973, she began a new relationship, this time with a fellow inmate named Patricia Cairns. By November, their clam bake bonded them inextricably, and they whipped up a plan to help Myra escape from prison. They had to plan carefully. Myra Hindley was one of the most hated people in Great Britain. They both dreamed of moving to Brazil and working as missionaries. When their escape plan came to light, Myra received an extra 12 months on her sentence. Big deal. What was one more year on a life sentence? She was already resigned to spending the rest of her life among the clitorati. At that point, a shared space with Big Bertha might have been the only effective punishment. Ian Brady spent almost 20 years in prison, until he was transferred to the Ashworth Psychiatric Hospital, where he was diagnosed as a psychopath. He told staff he didn't want to be released and that he wanted permission to die. He went on a hunger strike in 1999 and had to be force-fed. It became a regular occurrence until 2012. Brady became a true crime scholar of sorts, publishing a book about serial killers in 2001 entitled The Gates of Janus. 6 quotes from that book. The concept of hell and endless torment is popular with those who believe they aren't headed there. We do whatever we enjoy doing. Whether it happens to be judged good or evil is a matter for others to decide. One should try to be honest with oneself almost as a daily devotion. We are what we believe we are at given times. Good laws left to the interpretation of evil men are no longer good. Without temptation, what value is virtue? Madame Tussauds in London sent a letter to Ian asking him for details about his appearance, like his eye color and clothing measurements. They were making a wax model of him for their House of Horrors exhibit. In the 80s, Ian heard Myra was eligible for parole, so he confessed that he and Myra committed 2 more murders. At one point, Myra confessed to all the murders in detail. The interview was recorded and amounted to a total of 17 hours. Both Ian and Myra went with police to Saddleworth Moor on separate occasions to show detectives where the remaining bodies were hidden. November 2002. Myra Hindley died in prison at the age of 60 from bronchial pneumonia as a complication of heart disease. May 15th, 2017. Ian Brady died in Ashworth Hospital. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.